Ken Curtis, the man who brought Festus Hagen to life on Gunsmoke, wasn't just another Western sidekick. He was the heart of the show, gritty, loyal, and unpredictable. Behind that scruffy beard and thick country drawl was a man of deep conviction, fierce loyalty, and strong opinions. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even when it rubbed Hollywood the wrong way. But in his final years, Curtis reportedly opened up about the 5 actors he truly couldn't stand working with, and the reasons behind those grudges paint a fascinating picture of the man behind the cowboy hat. The first name on Ken Curtis's list was Milburn Stone, who played Doc Adams on Gunsmoke. On screen, their relationship was electric, Festus, the scruffy deputy, constantly teasing the grumpy old Doc, yet always having his back. Audiences adored their banter, believing the chemistry came from real-life friendship. But behind the scenes, their dynamic wasn't nearly as warm. Curtis and Stone reportedly had frequent disagreements over creative control and delivery. Stone, being one of the longest-standing cast members, often acted like the unofficial leader on set. Curtis, however, was fiercely independent and hated being told what to do, especially by someone he considered an equal, not a superior. Crew members described heated arguments between the two that sometimes halted filming for hours. Stone was known to have a sharp tongue, and Curtis wasn't one to back down. Yet, despite the tension, they always managed to bring that fiery energy to the screen. Curtis once said in an old interview that Milburn was stubborn as a mule, but maybe that's why Gunsmoke worked so well. You can't make good drama without a little conflict. While the two never became close friends off camera, they shared a begrudging respect that made their on-screen rivalry unforgettable. The second name Curtis mentioned was Dennis Weaver, who portrayed Chester Goode, Marshall Dillon's first deputy on Gunsmoke before Festus arrived. When Weaver left the show in 1964 to pursue other opportunities, it caused ripples across the Gunsmoke family. To many, his departure was just a career move. But to Curtis, it felt personal. He believed that Weaver abandoned the team when the series needed him most. Curtis reportedly said in private conversations that Weaver walked out when things got tough, leaving others to pick up the pieces. Ironically, Weaver's exit gave Curtis his big break. He replaced Chester as the new deputy, Festus Hagen. The role became iconic and made Ken Curtis a household name. But even with the fame, Curtis carried some resentment. He often mentioned that Weaver had the talent but not the heart to stay loyal to a project long-term. Curtis, who came from humble roots, believed in sticking with people through thick and thin. That sense of loyalty defined his whole life, so he couldn't respect anyone who he thought lacked it. Still, he never denied Weaver's talent. He once told a reporter, "Dennis was a fine actor, just not my kind of man." It was a subtle but pointed way of saying their values simply didn't align. The third name on Curtis's list was perhaps the most surprising, John Wayne. Yes, the John Wayne, one of Hollywood's biggest legends. The two had worked together on multiple westerns, including Rio Grande, 1950, and The Searchers, 1956, long before Gunsmoke made Curtis famous. Curtis respected Wayne's charisma and the way audiences adored him, but behind the scenes, he saw a very different man. Wayne was known for dominating every set he stepped onto. His voice, his opinions, his presence, they were larger than life. But for a man like Ken Curtis, who valued humility and respect for every crew member, Wayne's commanding personality could be suffocating. Curtis once described him as a man who filled every room with his ego before he even walked in. While he never outright badmouthed Wayne in public, those close to him recalled that Curtis struggled with the way Wayne treated others, especially those beneath him on the Hollywood ladder. One assistant director from The Searchers once shared that Curtis admired Wayne's work ethic but couldn't tolerate his arrogance. Wayne was the kind of man who would bark orders, demand retakes, and expect others to fall in line. Curtis, meanwhile, was raised to believe that respect had to go both ways, whether you were the star or the stagehand. Their tension simmered quietly for years, but Curtis never forgot it. He later said, "I liked the man's movies, but not always the man himself." Despite their differences, Curtis never denied Wayne's impact on the Western genre. He credited him for setting a standard of toughness and grit that defined generations of cowboy films. But he also believed that fame had changed Wayne, made him forget the simple values that once defined good men. That belief would stick with Curtis for the rest of his life and influence how he treated everyone on his own sets. By the end of his career, Ken Curtis had become something rare in Hollywood, a man who could see through the glitz and still hold on to his integrity. His grudges weren't rooted in jealousy or pettiness, they came from a deep sense of moral conviction. The fourth name Curtis mentioned shocked many of his old colleagues: James Arce, the towering star of Gunsmoke. For 2 decades, Arce and Curtis had worked side by side as Marshal Matt Dillon and Festus Hagen. On screen, they looked inseparable. The no-nonsense lawman and the loyal, sometimes bumbling deputy who'd risk his life to protect him. But away from the cameras, their relationship was far from that brotherly bond fans imagined. Curtis deeply respected Arce's talent, but he also believed that Arce had grown distant and prideful as the show's fame skyrocketed. Arce, who had become the undisputed face of Gunsmoke, often kept to himself between takes, rarely mingling with castmates or the crew. Curtis, a man who thrived on camaraderie, found that cold professionalism hard to accept. He once said in private, "Jim forgot what made Gunsmoke special. It wasn't just the guns or the law, it was the people." Over the years, Curtis began to notice what he called Hollywood isolation creeping into Arce's personality. Whenever disagreements arose, whether about dialogue, direction, or the way certain scenes were shot, Arce tended to make the final call. For someone like Curtis, who had started his career from scratch and fought for every ounce of recognition, that level of authority felt unfair. He believed Gunsmoke was a family, and no family worked when one person's word ruled over everyone else's. Yet, despite his frustrations, Curtis never stopped respecting Arce's professionalism. When Gunsmoke ended in 1975, Curtis quietly admitted that no one could have carried that badge like Jim. Their tension never escalated into open hostility, but the distance between them never truly healed either. In interviews later in life, Curtis described his co-star with a bittersweet tone. He was a good man, just a lonely one. Sometimes loneliness turns into pride. It was a statement that summed up how Curtis felt, not hatred, exactly, but a deep disappointment in someone he once admired. The fifth and final name on Ken Curtis's list was perhaps the most complicated: Ken Curtis himself. In one of his rare late-life interviews, a journalist asked him if he ever regretted feuding with other actors. Curtis smiled faintly and said, "The man I hated the most was me." It was a moment of brutal honesty, and those who knew him say it revealed more about his character than any grudge he ever held. He wasn't being dramatic. Curtis truly wrestled with himself for years. Fame had brought him recognition, but it also made him more guarded, more critical, and at times, more difficult to work with.